Hi, I'm Tandy Floyd. I'm from the Kentucky Gateway Museum Center. I'm the education curator. We're glad to have you come through the Civil War exhibit today. When you look at the information on the walls and the artifacts, everything, all the artifacts that we have from the Kentucky Historical Society, the Medical Museum, and the artifacts that we have from our collection are real, and they're all from Kentucky. So it's kind of a neat thing. I realize y'all are from Ohio, but the thing of it was, if you were wanted to be a Yankee or a Northern persuasion from Kentucky, you would go to Ohio and join up. If you wanted to be a Confederate, you went to Tennessee and joined up. You had to sneak all the way across the state to join up because Kentucky was a neutral state. And because we were a neutral state, we had two presidents. We had Abraham Lincoln and we had Jefferson Davis as a president, and we had two sets of governors. You'll see on these maps that the reason Kentucky was so valuable was because it was exactly in the middle of both Union and Southern, and because we had railroads and we had the rivers that went by on both sides. We had the Mississippi and the Ohio that the soldiers could travel on. We were very important because the Northerners, of course, wanted to get south, but the Southerners tried to get north, not just because of trying to take over the land and everything, but it was the industrial part. And they were shipping all their cotton and everything up there. And that was another reason we were neutral, because we had so many people here in the state of Kentucky that felt both ways. I mean, you know, we were going to lose money because Northern was industrial, Southern was agricultural, and we used all those items. And because the Ohio River right here between you and Kentucky, between Ohio and Kentucky, was so important. And also ships like the Magnolia was a paddle wheel ship, and it would transport prisoners and soldiers as well as wounded. And they would bring them up and take them to Georgetown, Ohio, to hospitals, because they had field hospitals where they would have their battles, and then they would move the more wounded people up to bigger hospitals that could take care of those things. But you can see by the map why Kentucky was so important, because the economics linked Kentucky to both sides. Now, President Lincoln was, of course, born in Kentucky, and his wife, Mary Todd, was born and grew up in Kentucky. And they ridiculed Mary Todd on both sides. The Northerners thought she was a Southern spy, and the Southerners thought she was a traitor. She had brothers and sisters. A sister was married to a Confederate soldier. One of her stepbrothers was in charge of a prisoner of war camp. He was a Southerner, and he had the prisoners from the Union side. Jefferson Davis was a Kentucky native. Now, his wife was from Virginia, Verena Howe, but she was as much an abolitionist. She didn't believe in slavery either. When we talk about the two different presidents and the different governors, Kentucky had James F. Robinson and Thomas Bramlett, and then the Confederate government had George Washington Johnson, and he died at the Battle of Shiloh. So Richard Hawes was the second Confederate governor in Kentucky. But a lot of brothers against brothers, fathers against sons, because they all had different views of what they wanted to. It's not exclusively to border states. Every state, Ohio, had people that felt Southern secessionism was important, because it wasn't just about slavery, it was about Southern rights. You know, they did not want the Northern agriculture or the Northern industrial states to dictate what they had to do. And when you consider it was a time before tractors and things like that, it was wrong to own a person, but that was their tractor. You know, that was their help, and they couldn't have those plantations without those things, without those people to help them raise those crops, cultivate those crops, and bring them in. There were a lot of areas. You all have the Rankin House and the Parker House over in Ohio, and we had a lot of abolitionists over here, like the beer bowers and everything. Before the dams, the Ohio River was shallow in some parts, narrow in other parts, and during a drought, it was almost possible to walk across the river. And that's why we were so big on the Underground Railroad as well, because it was a close connection to Ohio and the first start of freedom. As a slave, you were not completely free when you got to Ohio. You weren't really free until you got to Canada, because they had the Fugitive Slave Act, where you could cross that river, go into Ohio, and get your slaves back and take them. So they weren't safe, but at least it was a start. When you look over here, technology during the time had improved. The guns were an improvement. The advent of the mini ball. If you look back here there's a round shot, and then there's one that looks like it's flat. That's a mini ball, and that was devised during the Civil War. And when it hit you, it would flatten out and it would shatter a bone. And if it shattered your bone, there was nothing that the doctor could do except for amputation. So there were so many amputations during the Civil War. If you look over here, I didn't know the Indians fought in the some of the Indians fought on the Confederate side, and the reason for that was they wanted to stop people from coming out to the West. So they fought for the Confederacy to keep all of those Yankees from coming in and moving out west. We've got a cannonball, we've got bugles. This one was presented to J.A. Knowlton. He was from Maysville. An original Confederate flag, and a lot of people always associate the Confederacy with the stars and the bars. That was their battle flag. The very first Confederate flag was a blue field with a white star. They call it the Bonnie Blue flag. And Kentucky is the 13th state on the Confederate flag. It would be the center star in the stars and the bars, and it was the 15th star on that, and it was the 15th star on the Union flag as well. Over here, Maysville was so torn brother against brother, families, that we had 2 Methodist churches, 2 Presbyterian churches, one for the north, one for the south. And everybody prayed to the same God, but the Southerners felt that they were perfectly agreeable with the Bible, that they could have slaves, where of course the abolitionists believed that no one should own a person. The last meeting, you have Stonewall Jackson. That was his last battle before he goes in, and of course you got Lee on the left. These are pictures, and we're emphasizing fashion in this part of the exhibit. Children dressed pretty much just like adults did at the time, and hoop skirts were very important to women. It was the most fabric that you could use, the wealthier you were. And we'll find out later that those hoop skirts were used for something else as well. But men's fashion, you're going to see colors and everything. Of course, everything was black and white back then because they didn't have colored photographs. But paisley, men wore paisleys back in the 1860s, and you'll notice from the lengths of the coats as well. Women's hair, very severe, parted in the middle, pulled back. They, you don't consider it, but Queen Victoria was in England at the same time that the Civil War was going on. In fact, Mary Todd Lincoln did a lot of her mourning based on what Queen Victoria did after Prince Albert died. So they were contemporaries of the time. So the fashions that you see on all the period costumed miniseries on TV, those would be the fashions that you see right now. Women at the time, they were scared that all the men were going to be killed in battle. So they tried to get married, you know, as quick as they could because they didn't want to be spinsters and they wanted to have some form of income. Another fashion trend during the time was beards for men, beards and facial hair. And when you look over here, you'll see that Lee and Grant, generals on both sides, had about the same facial hair. And it wasn't until that period that Abraham Lincoln, you know, we always see him with that big top hat and a full beard. He didn't have it until the 1860s because a little 11-year-old girl wrote him and said, your face wouldn't look quite so long if you had a full beard. So he grew it, and that's why he grew his beard. You're going to see sideburns that come down, and they were named after General Burnsides, and that's where you get the term sideburns. This Major General Alpheus Williams, when you look at his mustache and his beard, you're going to think, oh my God, why did his wife let him out of the house looking like that? This is a coat that belonged to a soldier that was under General Forrester's command. It would be a Confederate. It's a butternut, and you'll look at the buttons and everything, and you'll see on our mannequin, the uniform doesn't even fit, and if you turn it around, you know how they have those, like a little belt kind of thing? It would even tighten up. Confederates didn't have food, they didn't have a lot of ammunition, they didn't have a lot of weapons. What they had was what they brought from home. So they struggled, whereas the Union soldiers, they were given uniforms and everything. Most of the Confederates wore homespun. This is a Union vest. This is a butternut gray or butternut frock coat, and you can see it's got the velvet. And this is Elijah Wood's coat. He was in the Orphan Brigade, and the reason they called it the Orphan Brigade was because Kentucky, you know, you didn't really have a Confederate home. You had to go elsewhere to become a Confederate, so they called themselves orphans, and that's why they were in the Orphan Brigade. Not only did we have separate churches and separate and presidents, we had separate postal stations. There was a Southern Postal Service and a Northern Postal Service, and the envelopes had propaganda on them. When you look closely, you're going to see that it talks about if you are for the Union, you know, you're a good person. If you are for the Southern, you're a traitor, that kind of thing. So the propaganda was even on the envelopes outside. The stamps would be different. Jefferson Davis, you know how we have George Washington on our stamps and everything. Jefferson Davis was on the Southern stamps. A lot of different period. And then letters. Letters from home. If you were a Southerner, a lot of times your letter, if you were writing to the North to your family, it would go in the dead letter box because they wouldn't deliver it because it was from the South. You know, money. The Confederates made their own money, and of course when they lost the war, it wasn't worth anything. It was just a piece of paper, so anybody that invested in it would have lost everything. It was full of contradictions. This one you'll like. It's a $10 banknote from Aberdeen. They made their own money, and so each state did. This is the state of Florida. This is from Alabama. You've got Kentucky made I'm sure, their own money, Confederate, but it was almost worthless. in the Union States, and if they came to your farm and they took your cows and they gave you money for it, it was just like they took your cows. When you come over here, you know, everybody wrote Mom. This is a very touching letter home to his mother and his wife, and they didn't find this letter until after he'd been killed. It was in his trunk, and so it's, you know, a lot of people didn't get word where their sons had been killed or if they were killed. There's a story over here about 3 children in a picture. Amos, I forget what the other son was, and Alice. And it was found on a soldier's dead body. He was at Gettysburg, and they found it, and they didn't know who to notify. The man didn't have any other identification on his body except for this. And a little girl picked it up and gave it to somebody, and they posted it in the paper. Did anybody have any information about these 3 children? And they finally found out who it belonged to, and when the woman identified the picture, that was when she realized her husband had been killed. She didn't know otherwise. And that picture prompted an orphanage for Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers' children's, and a widow's pension. These are some items that you would find. This trunk is an actual Civil War trunk. That tin would have held information like a map or something. Spy glasses, of course, writing materials, things from home. And over on this other side, there's hardtack. A lot of times hardtack, and it was like a stale biscuit, would be the only thing they'd have to eat. When you look over here, men and young and old fought in the war. Some children lied about their age. There was one boy that was noted that he put a number in his shoe, and they asked him if he was over a certain age. And of course he was not physically over that certain age. He was standing over it, so he said, "Yes, I am." So he was able to join the Army. They found at Camp Nelson in Lexington, when they did some digging for artifacts, bottles of hair dye. And they knew that men would dye their hair so that they looked younger, so they could join the Army. And people didn't think they were too old. But young boys joined in, and drummer boys, if somebody was incapacitated and couldn't fight, they'd pick up their guns and fight as well. Or they would help the wounded come in. Music was a great part of the Civil War. Every regiment had a band. And of course, towards the end, when they didn't have enough soldiers to fight, those guys had to fight. But you're going to find military bands, and it was a time when the most music was made, and they still play Civil War music. So you got your Bonnie Blue Flag, your battle cry of freedom, and I know you've heard My Old Kentucky Home. Stephen Foster wrote that. You had George Root, who wrote information. This little boy enlisted in the Union Army at the age of 14 in Cincinnati. Lots and lots of stories about young boys who joined, and these are original instruments. That's an 1864 guitar. You've got William Bell's fife. He was a private in Company D in the 14th Kentucky Infantry. You've got a cornet and a bugle. This bugle was George Washington Payne's 2nd Kentucky Regiment, and it was picked up at Perryville. And it's also a haunted instrument. They say that if anybody blows the horn, you're going to have a storm. Look at her waist. This is an 1860s original dress. And women wore corsets at the time, and a lot of time they would put their children in corsets. Remember, we talked that the children wear the same outfits that the adults did. But if you wear a corset for so long, your body will adjust to it. And so the smaller the waist, the more feminine you were. I can't imagine where they even put their organs. It just blows my mind how teeny tiny. And then again, a lot of the women that married at the time were very, very young. You know, they were just 12, 13, 14. So you all would be old married women by now. Want to go upstairs? Technology was changing at the time. Railroads were very, very important because they would send soldiers back and forth, the troops, and so each side was constantly tearing up the train rails so that the trains couldn't get through to carry those men or supplies, and then they'd have to rebuild for their group to get back to where they needed to go. So there was a constant battle trying to keep the railways going. And Morgan and Cynthiana, John Hunt Morgan, that was his basic job, that his group would go and they'd tear up the railways so that they couldn't get through. There was a man from Fleming County, Kentucky, in Flemingsburg. His name was James J. Andrews, and he was a Union soldier, and he went down south and he stole a train that was used to carry goods and military, and he stole it and he brought it back up north. So they called it, the train was called the General, and it was designed to haul freight and passenger trains between Atlanta and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it was owned by the Southerners, and it often transported the Southern soldiers. So he commandeered that train and brought it up north. A lot of other technology, balloons, air balloons. They would go up and they would be able to survey where the other troops were so that they could see how close they were and everything. And the Union was big on that. In fact, Custer, who, you know, we remember him from The Last Stand, you know, with the Indians, but he was a Union soldier and he went up in one of the balloons, was scared to death. Then the Confederates designed one and started to look around and use that. Other technology, the first submarine was built during the Civil War. Now it sank, but they've done they brought it back up, the Hunley. And then the Monitor was another ironclad that fought in the Civil War. And then they would also take their paddle ships and put cannons on them and use those. In the Battle of Augusta, right there between, Ripley and Augusta, there were 3 ironclads that came up during the Battle of Augusta. They were Union ironclads. And John Hunt Morgan's group, Basil Duke, was in charge of it. This is a thing about the Battle of Augusta. And those ironclads, when the Confederates started shooting at them, they went away. They left. And those men were court-martialed for leaving the battle because, you know, they could have very easily won that particular battle had it not been for those men going away. Cynthiana, Kentucky, they went up through, they started out down south, John Hunt Morgan's men, and you'll see a lot of historical markers around, probably in Ohio as well, because they came here and they went up into Ohio and came back down around. Every year in October, we do a literacy campaign. I want you guys to take back some books for me today for Patty Ream and Pam Fannin. But we give free books to the schools for literature classes and history classes. But our book this year is The Widow of the South, and it's about Carrie McGavock and the Battle of Franklin. And there was Ohio and Kentucky regiments that fought down there. It was a huge battle. Thousands and thousands, over 8,000 people were killed in that town. If you can imagine, there's only 8,700 and some people in Maysville, Kentucky. and you think that over 8,000 people were killed in that battle, that would be almost everybody in this town dead. And they pretty much buried those soldiers where they lied. And these farmers wanted to plow their fields. Well, there's bodies everywhere. So when you read the book, you'll find out what Carrie McGavitt did. It's based on a true story. And she reinterred all those bodies and had them taken to her plantation. So she has McGavitt's Confederate cemetery, because the Unions, of course, they won the battles, so they got to come back and get their dead and take them to a national cemetery. Whereas the Confederates, the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they were responsible for most of the Confederate soldiers being found. You know, you might be found along the roadway, you might be found on somebody's farm, you might be found in town. A lot of people don't know where the daughters were buried. But a group of us went down to Franklin after we read the book because it was so interesting, and we took a wreath and put it down by the Kentucky soldiers. Literature and art during the time, like we said before, pictures weren't done in color. So you've got black and white, and you had artisans that would go out into the field and they would draw pictures of the different scenes that they saw. And these are the artists. You've got Mr. Wald, you've got Winslow Homer, you've got artists that would paint, and those are the only colored pictures that you would see. Eastman Johnson, you know, the Eastman Johnson Kodak company, now we call it Kodak, but he was a great artist of the time. And Henry Mosler, Harper's Ferry, was a news article, you know, newspaper that followed the war. And you didn't have radio and you didn't have Tennessee, so you read the papers all the time. And they were the ones that kept you up on things. And these are Ohio pictures as well as Kentucky pictures over here. Women, remember we talked about those famous hoop skirts? Women had, you know, it was the very first time that women actually had jobs, because unless you were a teacher, spinster teacher, you didn't work. You stayed at home, you took care of the children and everything, and women would dress as men and become soldiers, or they would be camp followers and they would follow the troops and help feed them, do the laundry and everything. A lot of women spies at the time, and those hoop skirts could hide a lot of guns, pistols. They would tie pistols up underneath, or they would tie letters of information, and men weren't going to mess with your underwear, so they weren't going to look for those places. But a lot of women spies, and there were also prostitutes. Bill Breesling in Lexington, you know, if you couldn't teach or be a nurse or something like that, you had to be industrious. So they were working women, and a lot of different spies. One woman, her husband took care of a cemetery, and when he went off to war, she would dig the graves and she would take care of the cemetery. So women were left to take care of everything that was at home. And a lot of times that meant to protect your children from anybody that would come in and try to rob you, because you were a defenseless woman at home and there was nobody there to protect you. So they had to protect themselves. It wasn't just wounds from gunshots or sabers or bayonets that killed the soldiers. The majority of the soldiers died of disease and gangrene. So if you got shot and you got infection, the thing with that mini ball or those rounds, if they shot you, the material from your uniform would go into that as well. And you didn't bathe, and you didn't have clean clothes, so all of the bacteria and everything that you had on that clothes went into your skin. And so you got gangrene, and that gangrene would eat up your arm and most times kill you. This person has gangrene. Goldsmith, Middleton Goldsmith from Louisville, Kentucky, he did a lot of research during that time, and he went back to work at the University of Kentucky. Here we've got frostbite, We've got different smallpox, a lot of different kinds of diseases. And when they'd ever have a battle, they would take over a house, just like they did in Widow of the South. They used Carrie McGavick's house as a field hospital. They would take over that building and use it and bring it in. You've got different homes around here. Perryville was a huge battle, the Battle of Augusta. This house was used in Augusta, Kentucky as a field hospital. And triage, you know how when you have war and you go to the hospital and they decide if you're a severe patient and you need to go in right away, or if you just got a minor injury and you have to sit out in the waiting room for a while. Triage was first invented during the Civil War. These are different items. This is a surgeon's coat, and you can see the dried blood on his shirt. The medical regiment had different clothing to wear. At that time, you weren't sedated very much. You had chloroform. They would put a rag with some of this chloroform inside this funnel and put it over your face, and it would put you out just for a little while. This is a wooden stethoscope. You know how the little metal stethoscopes when the doctor listens to your lungs? This is a wooden one that started out. You've got bullet probes and that also work for needles, for sutures and everything. Bandage roller. A lot of the women at home would cut up their skirt, their petticoats and everything like that to make bandages. If you look at the tools, if you get close up over here at the tools that they used, very primitive. This is a blister cut. And they would heat it up with the candle, and then they would put it over the item or the sore, and it would cause a blister for that infection to come up to the top. You know, we don't think of that. This is a trocar. It's designed to suck the pus out of a wound. You've got the forceps and everything. You've got different items. And of course, the pictures. You would have either a door or a shutter or a table from the house that you were working in, and it would be a constant work for the doctor to amputate and everything, and they would just throw the limbs out of a window. And they say a lot of times those limbs would go right up to the windowsill. This picture shows a pile of bloody stumps, hands, feet. And of course, all three of these men have amputated legs. He has an amputated arm. But it was also started in the Confederacy that every regiment have a surgeon. And it was the Civil War that started the nurses. Women became nurses. You had Margaret Breckinridge from Kentucky. You had, the woman that Abraham Lincoln, she started the Red Cross. And Lincoln said, "Where are all these bodies?" And she was in charge of going out and finding Union bodies. But she was also one of the great nurses of the Civil War. Over here, again, we talked about how you were buried, where you laid. A lot of times, trenches were built to protect a regiment while they were fighting, and then afterwards they would just haul the bodies over to their trenches instead of digging new burial plots, and they would just cover it up. It would be mass graves. And there was really no way to identify a lot of the soldiers. Tattoos became very popular at the time because men would tattoo their names and their information in case they were killed, so somebody knew who to get. If you had a friend who fought with you, they might write your name on a barrel stave or something and put it with the body and try to write down where you were so that you could give it to the family, and then after the war they could come and get you. It was the first time for embalming. Embalming methods were improved. You know, we always think of the Egyptians as embalming everybody, but it was the first war because people would want to come and get their sons and take them back to the family plot, back here in Ohio or in Kentucky, and they died in Tennessee. Well, if they died in Tennessee, 2 weeks ago, they're pretty gross, you know, to travel, but if you embalmed them, their body could stay pretty good. And Abraham Lincoln was the first president that was embalmed, and they had a funeral train. He traveled through a lot of northern states, and people, you know, went out to watch the train go by. Memorial Day was devised, they called it Decoration Day at first, but Memorial Day was devised because of the Civil War. Mother's Day was another one that was devised for the Civil War because it was so important. In Maysville, we had Bull Nelson, General Bull Nelson, and we had Albert Sidney Johnston in Mason County. So we had generals from both sides. And Leonidas Metcalf was a general. We had a Union camp outside of Maysville called Camp Kenton. And Bull Nelson told Leonidas Metcalf to go and arrest anybody that was a Southern secessionist. And he ended up arresting 7 of Maysville's most prominent men. You had James Hall. He owned an iron factory, the Plow Works. You had Richard Henry Stanton. He was a great statesman from here. We had merchants that were important. We had paper editors. And one of the people that he had arrested was our mayor, Casto. And when he got out of prison, he met with Leonidas Metcalf's second down at the Lee House at the end of this street and challenged him to a duel. And they went out to Dover on a sandbar because it was illegal to have a duel in Kentucky. They went out on this sandbar and they had the duel, you know, with the guns and the pistols, and our mayor was killed. And all of these men are buried in the Maysville Cemetery. And one of the most interesting and sad things that I found, there was a General Stephen Burbridge, who was known as Butcher Burbridge. He had a rule in Kentucky that if any Union person, citizen or soldier, was harmed in Kentucky, they would take 4 prisoners out and shoot them, just random prisoners. And this boy from Maysville was the son of William Hunt, who was one of the men that was arrested. Thomas was his only son. And there was somebody that had, you know, either lost a barn in a fire or something like that, and they pulled 4 soldiers, and Thomas was one of those boys. He was in a prison camp that was in Frankfort, close to where our state capital is, and they shot 4 of the boys. Thomas was one. And if you go to the Maysville Cemetery and you find Thomas's tombstone, it says shot by order of Burbridge. And I think there were 50 soldiers that were shot under that rule here in Kentucky. Terrible, terrible. There is no honorable way to kill, no gentle way to destroy. There's nothing good in war except its ending. You know, towards the end, it was just senseless because it was just, you know, I'm going to fight until I die, because the South knew that they were losing, and they were sick and they were tired, and the Northern soldiers were sick and tired of it too. So luckily everything worked out the right way, and we had the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln had it. The only problem was with the Emancipation Proclamation, they freed all the slaves in the southern states. They didn't free them in the northern states, and they didn't free them in the neutral states. You didn't become a free slave until either your master let you be free slave or until after the war. So we have the Star, Northern Star quilt out. A lot of slaves made quilts that gave certain signals. Follow the Northern Star, that led you to the north, that led you to freedom. There might be one that was called a bow tie, and that meant that the person, the conductor on the Underground Railroad that you were going to meet, was going to give you new clothes so that you didn't look like a slave, so that nobody would think that you were a slave. And a lot of interesting things about the Civil War. Basil Duke survived the war, where John Hunt Morgan was captured and killed, but a lot of these men came back and they were friends with, that they fought against. It was a terrible, terrible time.